Today, I'm going to go through and explain the Truffula notebook, which is a Jupyter notebook for the data science activity for the correlation and causation lesson. At this point, the students should already have experience with running code boxes in Jupyter notebooks. They should have already interacted with a tutorial notebook sometime before, and they should be reassured by you continuously that they should never have to understand the code. They should never have to code themselves. They don't have to read the code. They just have to run them by pressing Shift Return. So this notebook introduces the students to the idea of randomized control trials. And the goal of it is to let the students play with this notebook in an interactive way and learn about the following concepts. They should learn how to assign various groups, experimental groups with different conditions. They should be able to assign two groups, one being the control group and the other one being the intervention group. And three, they should be able to assign experimental conditions to the intervention group. They should learn how to set that up. And then they should be able to run the experiment and collect data and interpret the plots of the data in order to make some conclusions about whether or not there is any correlation, whether there's any causation, and if there is, in which direction the causation goes. The story revolves around around our resident botanist, Hans. And Hans has an orchard where he planted 500 of these fictional truffula trees. And he's wondering about the relationship between the number of bees that land on each tree on a daily basis and the number of fruits that each tree produces throughout the whole fruit-bearing season. Now, to investigate whether there's any relationship between those two variables, he first starts by performing an observational study. An observational study is just something where he observes all the trees, collects the data without touching them, without intervening in the natural course of these trees. So let's start by first running this box, which sets up the entire notebook. Then let's actually start running the experiment. So Hans starts by assigning all 500 trees in his orchard to a single group, which we've named the observation group, with assigned samples from 1 through 500. You will notice that all of these are grayed out at the moment. You will be able to interact with them very soon, but right now, we don't want the students to be able to mess with those, and so they've been grayed out. Here is a visualization of the orchard. You should think of this as a top-down map of the whole orchard, and each blue dot here represents a single truffula tree. You can see that all of them have the same color, all assigned to the single group called observation. So it's not very interesting just yet. Next, let's run this box and see the experimental parameters that he has set on the single group observation with 500 samples. You'll notice that we have set no intervention on both the number of bees and the number of fruits. This means that we're not changing these values. We're not affecting these values run their natural course over the fruit-bearing season. Again, they're grayed out. It's very important that you first press this button, perform experiment, before you move on to the next block. Otherwise, the notebook is going to complain. So let's perform the experiment. Then let's run this box to visualize the experimental data that's been collected. The first thing that you would like to choose is the gradient variable. Which variable of the trees do we want to visualize at the moment? So let's say we want to visualize the number of bees. Again, we have this top-down view of the whole orchard, and each tree is now color-coded according to this gradient by how many bees we find to be landing on that tree on a daily basis. So the more yellow it is, the warmer the color, the higher the number of bees. And the colder the color, the fewer bees land on that tree. And finally, we're going to make another plot by running this box. This is where we can investigate whether there's any correlation between two different variables. So for the x-axis, you would like to choose the number of fruits. And for the y-axis, you'd like to choose the number of bees. This way, you can plot the number of bees against the number of fruits in the same plot. And as you can see, there is a sort of general upward swath. So that means that there is a positive correlation between the number of fruits and the number of bees. Namely, the higher the number of fruits, we can also predict that the higher the number of bees, and vice versa. However, what we cannot say is whether or not there is any causation between these two variables. Here, the notebook gives you a bunch of numbers that might be useful to you. The higher the correlation and the closer to 1 it is, the more positive the correlation is. The p-value here is given, and you can see it's a very, very small number. Now, at this point, the students should not already know what p-values are, or they shouldn't be expected to know it. They also shouldn't be expected to know what the correlation number means. But you can give them the intuition that the higher this number, the higher the correlation, and the lower this number, the closer to 0 it is, the stronger the association or the correlation between the two variables is. So that's part 1. And the students can answer these questions about the implication of correlation and causation from this data. Now for part 2, Hans is actually going to start performing an experiment and no longer merely observes it. So over the course of the following summer, he now randomly separates the 500 truffula trees into 2 groups of 250. Now, for one of the 2 groups, he diligently plucks out all the fruits that are starting to grow on these trees, so that these trees never actually have any grown fruits on them. In essence, he has performed an intervention on the variable of the number of fruits. And he's left the other group, 250 trees, entirely alone. And then he records the daily number of bees that land on each of the trees. So let's run this box now to set up that experiment. As you can see, Hans set up 2 groups, the control group and the intervention group, namely the ones where he has plucked out all the fruits. He has randomly assigned a bunch of trees to each of the groups, and that's what this list of numbers means. Here you can visualize which trees he has assigned to which group, labeled by red and blue. Next up, we'll see how he actually set up the intervention in terms of this interface here. In the control group, we remain at no intervention and no intervention on the number of bees and fruits. However, on the intervention group with no fruits, we have left the bees at no intervention, but we have set the number of fruits to be fixed at 0. That means that the number of fruits on each of those trees in the intervention group has 0 fruits throughout the whole season. With that setup, let's perform the experiment. With the data collected, we'll run this. And again, we'll choose our variables for the x-axis and for the y-axis. Now, this time we'll do something different. Let's just choose the number of bees on the x-axis. And for the y-axis, we will say none, distributions only. What that does is we're ignoring the number of fruits as a variable to plot, we're only looking at the number of bees as a distribution, as a histogram. So as you can see in the blue control group, we have these blue lines here, and in intervention group, we have these red lines here. The takeaway of this graph is that there is not a huge difference in the number of bees that end up landing on those trees, even when you pluck out all the fruits from the trees that are labeled red in the intervention group. So that means there is not a very strong correlation between plucking out fruits and the number of bees that land on them. So what we can conclude here is that there is no causation, or not any clear visible causation of the number of fruits on the number of bees. The bees come regardless. Now for part 3, it's up to the students to design this experiment. The goal is for the students to find out exactly whether or not there is any causation in any direction, and to demonstrate that using data. So let me give the solution here. Now we've investigated whether the number of fruits affects the number of bees. The natural question to then ask is whether the number of bees in turn affects the number of fruits. Let's set up this experiment. Now we finally get to fill in these boxes ourselves. Here we have group 1, which we will call control, just as before. Let's add another group and name it intervention. Now, just to be clear, this is the group in which we are preventing bees from landing on the trees. You don't have to randomly type out numbers here in the assigned samples. All you have to do is press randomized assignment. That automatically populates these boxes with a random selection of 250 trees for each of the groups. Once that's done, we can visualize assignment to record these settings. Now, it's very important that you don't just type 1 through 250 in this box and 251 through 500 in this box, because the trees in this program are listed 1 through 500 in a very orderly manner. And so if you assign 1 through 250 to the same group, that would mean all the northern half goes to the same group and the southern half goes to the other group. And that might be a confounding factor. So make sure these numbers are randomly assigned. Next, let's set up the experimental intervention. As before, the control group should receive absolutely no intervention here. So let's leave these dials there. For the intervention group, where there should be no bees, let's fix the number of bees to 0. And let's leave the number of fruits to have no intervention performed on it. So with that set up, let's perform the experiment and collect the data. Let's plot the data as usual. This time we'll do something very similar to previously. We will select instead now the number of fruits, because now we're investigating whether or not removing all the bees from the 250 trees in the intervention group would affect the number of fruits that end up growing on these trees throughout the fruit-bearing season. So on the x-axis, you would like to choose the number of fruits. On the y-axis, none, in order to show just a histogram, a distribution. Immediately, the result is very striking. In the blue control group, there is a wide range of number of fruits, going all the way up to above 30. Whereas in the red intervention group, where the bees have been removed, the distribution of the number of fruits is significantly lower, not going above 15. So there is a very strong correlation between removing the bees from a tree and the number of fruits that end up growing on that tree. And because we have performed an intervention on the number of bees and we have observed a correlation, according to our definition of causation as correlation under intervention, we can conclude that there is causation from the number of bees to the number of fruits. So the number of bees, the higher the number of bees actually causes there to be a high number of fruits. So this is the lesson that we would like the students to take away after going through this notebook. Finally, there is a free play area where the students can choose to perform a totally new experiment. You can, in fact, assign multiple groups, 2, 3, 4, as many groups as you want, and randomly assign samples or trees to these groups. And then you get to perform an intervention on many more parameters than the ones that we have introduced previously. So this is an area where students can play with randomized controlled trials and perform as many randomized controlled trials as they want, and then interpret the data by plotting them on a graph.